July 1944. The war isn't over. Hitler is still alive. American soldiers are still fighting in Europe. Entire cities across the continent are rubble. And yet, in the mountains of New Hampshire, at a quiet resort hotel, 44 nations are gathering, not to negotiate peace, not to divide territory, to decide who will control money. The Mount Washington Hotel stands tall against the summer sky, polished floors, white columns, manicured lawns. Inside, exhausted diplomats, ashtrays filling up, maps spread across tables, voices raising in multiple languages. Because everyone in that room understands something terrifying. The last time the global economy collapsed, it didn't just cause a recession, it helped cause a world war. The Great Depression wasn't just about stock markets. It was about countries panicking, slamming shut their borders, manipulating currencies, turning inward, blaming each other. Trade collapsed, trust evaporated, extremism flourished. And now, before the guns even fall silent, these leaders are asking one dangerous question. If we don't build something better, does this all happen again? So they gather, Americans, British, Soviets, Chinese, Latin Americans, in one hotel in the White Mountains, not to win a war, but to prevent the next one. Because they know something most people don't. Wars are fought with bullets, but they often begin with broken economies. And in that hotel, in 1944, the foundation of the modern financial world was quietly laid. The system that would make the US dollar the center of global trade. The system that would anchor currencies. The system that would shape your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, and America's relationship with the rest of the world. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a decision about power. And America walked into that room holding more leverage than anyone else on Earth. Before Bretton Woods, the global economy had already tried something once, and it failed. After World War I, countries tried to go back to the gold standard, like nothing had happened, like the war hadn't drained treasuries, like debt hadn't exploded, like economies weren't warped beyond recognition. It was economic denial. Governments fixed their currencies to gold at unrealistic values. Trade imbalances widened. Gold started flowing unevenly. Countries ran out of reserves. And when that happened, they panicked. Instead of cooperating, they blamed each other. Instead of adjusting gradually, they slammed doors. Currencies were devalued overnight. Tariffs went up. Imports were punished. Exports were weaponized. The United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, raising duties on thousands of goods. Other countries retaliated. Global trade collapsed. Between 1929 and 1933, world trade fell by nearly two-thirds. Two-thirds! Factories shut down, banks failed, unemployment soared. And when people lose jobs, savings, and dignity at the same time, they don't calmly debate monetary policy. They look for somebody to blame. Economic chaos fed political extremism. Germany, Italy, Japan. The Depression wasn't the only cause of World War II, but it poured gasoline on a continent already soaked in resentment. And here's the lesson the world learned the hard way. When currencies become weapons, war doesn't stay economic for long. By 1944, the leaders gathering in New Hampshire weren't just trying to rebuild trade. They were trying to prevent economic nationalism from ever spiraling that far again. Because they understood something that still matters today. If countries don't trust each other's money, they stop trusting each other at all. And that's when the world fractures. By the summer of 1944, most of the world was exhausted. Europe's factories were bombed, infrastructure was shattered, governments were buried in debt, currencies were fragile. But the United States? The United States was different. Its mainland was untouched. Its factories were running at full speed. Its economy had expanded during the war. And most importantly, it held the gold. Nearly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves sat inside American vaults, which meant something simple. If the next global system was going to be anchored to stability, it would be anchored to America. Now, this wasn't declared as empire. There were no speeches about dominance. There were spreadsheets. There were negotiations. There were arguments between economists like John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White about how much power the United States should hold. But the math was clear. Other countries needed stability, and stability required an anchor. So the deal that emerged at Bretton Woods was elegant. Every country would peg its currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold, $35 per ounce. Simple, predictable, disciplined. This created something the world had never really had before: a coordinated global monetary system. Exchange rates stabilized, trade could expand, investments could flow, reconstruction could begin. And quietly, without a military conquest, without a dramatic announcement, the dollar became the center of the world. Not because it was forced, but because it was trusted. And once the dollar became the anchor, everything else began to orbit around it. When the war ended, Europe was rebuilding. Factories had to be reconstructed. Currencies had to be stabilized. Trade had to restart. And almost every country needed one thing: dollars. Because under Bretton Woods, the dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. That meant if you wanted stability, if you wanted access to trade, if you wanted reconstruction loans, you needed dollars. And here's what made this powerful. The United States wasn't just rich after the war, it was stable. Its government functioned. Its courts operated. Its infrastructure was intact. Its political system, despite disagreements, held together. So countries did something pragmatic. They began holding US dollars in their reserves. Not because they loved America, because it worked. And over time, something subtle happened. The dollar didn't just anchor exchange rates. It became the world reserve currency, which sounds abstract. It isn't. A reserve currency is what governments hold to settle international trade. Oil is priced in dollars. Shipping contracts are priced in dollars. Global debt is often issued in dollars. That means countries everywhere, from Japan to Brazil, need dollars to operate in the global economy. And when countries need dollars, they hold US Treasury bonds, which means they lend money to the United States. Now here's where this affects you. Because when the world buys US debt, interest rates stay lower than they otherwise would be. Lower government borrowing costs ripple outward. Lower mortgage rates, lower car loan rates, lower business borrowing costs, cheaper imports, stronger purchasing power. Your standard of living is quietly subsidized by global demand for the dollar. And this only works for one reason: trust. Countries believe the US will honor its debt. The political system won't implode. The dollar won't collapse overnight. The rule of law will remain intact. As long as that belief holds, the dollar remains dominant. But reserve currency status is not a birthright. It's a confidence game. If the United States were to become politically unstable, if it defaulted on its debt, if it weaponized its currency recklessly, if it undermined its own institutions. Countries would begin diversifying away from the dollar. And if that happened, the impact would not be abstract. Foreign demand for US debt would fall. Treasury yields would rise, mortgage rates would climb, credit would tighten, imports would become more expensive, inflationary pressure would increase. America would still be wealthy, but borrowing would cost more, living would cost more, and global influence would shrink. This is not about patriotism, it's about stability. The dollar became the world reserve currency because in 1944, the United States was the most stable, large economy left standing after World War II. And every day since, that status has depended on maintaining that stability. The Bretton Woods system eventually changed, but the dollar dominance endured because the world kept choosing it, and the world keeps choosing it, for now. So let's ask this question plainly. What happens if the world decided to stop choosing the dollar? Right now, the US dollar still dominates global reserves, but that dominance is not as overwhelming as it once was. In the first quarter of 2025, about 58% of official foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars. That might sound huge, but the number has been falling slowly over decades. In 1999, the share was over 70%. And while central banks still hold more dollars than any other currency, they are diversifying into euros, yen, and even gold instead of staking everything on US Treasury bonds. So what would it mean if that trend kept going? Or worse, if something happened in the US to make other countries view America as unstable? 1. Less demand for the US dollar. Right now, countries hold dollars because they need them for international trade and reserves. Less demand means the dollar would weaken relative to other currencies. A weaker dollar means imported goods cost more for Americans, inflation could tick up, US purchasing power erodes, your savings don't go as far. Even goods that are made in America still usually get their raw materials from abroad. These are not theory, they're basic currency math. 2. Higher US borrowing costs. One of the biggest privileges of having reserve currency status is what economists call an exorbitant privilege. Foreign governments buy US debt in the form of treasury bonds because they want a safe place to park money. That demand keeps US interest rates lower than they otherwise would be. Why? Well, imagine you have two friends wanting to borrow $20 from you. One friend you know to be reliable and will always pay you back on Friday. The other friend still hasn't paid you back for the last $20 that he borrowed. Who are you charging a higher interest rate to? Stability or chaos? That is essentially how demand for currency works. Nobody wants to tie their worth to a currency that is unstable. If that demand weakens, treasury yields rise, government borrowing costs goes up, everything tied to interest rates gets more expensive. Yes, that includes your mortgage rate. But it's not gloomy yet. Here's the optimistic twist. The dollar still accounts for almost 58% of global reserves, more than double the closest competitor. There's no real single alternative reserve currency yet. Not the euro, not the pound, not crypto. Multiple analysts believe the world will keep choosing the dollar for decades. So this is not a ticking time bomb. It is a responsibility. So what's the takeaway? The dollar became the world reserve currency because of stability built after Bretton Woods. But reserve currency status isn't guaranteed forever. It depends on trust. Trust in institutions, trust in governance, trust in predictable policy. If that trust erodes, foreign demand for US assets could slow, which could mean higher interest rates, more expensive borrowing, potentially weaker economic growth, higher consumer prices. Not an apocalypse, just more friction in the economy you live in. And on the flip side, if the US maintains stability and stays a reliable anchor for the global system, the dollar keeps getting chosen, and that benefit keeps flowing into the American economy. So let's zoom back out. July 1944. One hotel, 44 countries, a bunch of exhausted men in suits arguing about exchange rates while the world was still on fire. They weren't trying to dominate. They were trying to make sure the global economy didn't light itself on fire again. And somehow, it worked. For almost 80 years, the world kept choosing the dollar. Not because America is perfect, but because stability is valuable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hotel that quietly built the modern financial world, hit subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments, do you think the dollar keeps its spot at the center of the system? Or are we watching the beginning of a slow shift? This has been Bear Markets and Bad Decisions. I'm Heather Shell, and I'll see you next week. Hopefully with interest rates lower than 8%.